The silence began at 3:33 a.m., a quiet so profound it had weight and texture, smothering the familiar nocturnal sounds of Oakwood, Missouri. It was not the gentle hush of a sleeping town, but an abrupt and absolute cessation, as if the world itself had drawn a sharp, startled breath and forgotten to exhale. On March 15, 1888, the heartbeat of the town, the steady, reliable tick of 100 clocks, simultaneously ceased. The first to notice was the night watchman, old Jeremiah Potts, whose pocket watch grew cold and still against his chest as he made his rounds. He shook it, held it to his ear, and heard only the frantic thumping of his own heart in reply. From the grand clock face on the town hall to the delicate porcelain timepiece on Eliza Miller's mantel, every gear had frozen, every pendulum hung motionless. The hands, all of them, pointed in perfect, unnatural unison to the same impossible moment. People began to stir, not from noise, but from the lack of it. The absence of the mill's water wheel groaning in the creek, the lack of a distant train whistle cutting through the plains. It was a void that pulled them from their beds. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, wrapped in robes and fear, their breath pluming in the unseasonably chill air. They gathered in hushed clusters on porches and in the rutted dirt of Main Street, their whispers the only sound, sharp and sibilant against the oppressive quiet. They pointed at their own watches, held up lanterns to confirm the shared, chilling truth. A low murmur of panic began to ripple through the crowd, a current of dread that was older than the town itself. The fear was not born solely of the stopped clocks. It was fed by memory, by stories passed down in hushed tones around winter fires. Old Mrs. Gable, her face a roadmap of wrinkles etched deep by 80 years of Missouri living, clutched her shawl tight and muttered about signs and portents, her eyes wide with a knowing terror. She spoke of a similar stillness that had preceded the great blizzard of '78, and of older tales still, whispered warnings of curses that slept in the soil of the land they had built upon. The darkness seemed to thicken, the starlight above feeling cold and distant. The familiar shapes of homes and shops now looked like tombstones in the gloom, and the stopped clocks were not just broken machines. They were omens, each one a silent scream in the night. The people of Oakwood stood trapped in that elongated moment, their world unmoving, their future suddenly a terrifying and unknown country. While the ghosts of past warnings took solid form in the chilling air around them, the stagecoach rattled into Oakwood like a dying man's last cough, its wheels kicking up plumes of dust that hung in the still air, refusing to settle. For Elias Thorne, the journey from St. Louis had been a monotonous procession of rolling hills and sleepy hamlets, but nothing had prepared him for the absolute inertia of this place. He stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of what should have been a bustling Main Street, his leather satchel heavy with notepads and a healthy skepticism, and immediately felt the wrongness of it all. It was the silence that struck him first, a deep, marrow-level quiet that went beyond the mere absence of noise. It was a presence in itself, a suffocating blanket thrown over the town. His eyes, trained to notice the details that others missed, scanned the scene. A general store stood with its door ajar, a single broom leaning against the frame as if its user had simply vanished mid-task. A blacksmith's forge was cold, the anvil silent, but it was the clocks that held his gaze. Through the grimy window of the post office, a regulator clock's hands were frozen at 3:33. A bank's elegant timepiece, visible through its polished glass, told the same impossible story. Every public face, every private glimpse through a parlor window, confirmed the same eternal, suspended moment. It was as if the entire town had been holding its breath for days, waiting for a signal to resume living that never came. He made his way to the town's only saloon, the Lone Star, pushing through the swinging doors into a cavern of shadow and suspicion. The few men hunched over their drinks did not look up as he entered, but he felt their attention shift, a subtle tightening of the atmosphere. The bartender, a thick-set man with a weary face, polished a glass with a slow, circular motion that seemed to have no beginning and no end. When Elias ordered a whiskey, the man's eyes flickered over him, taking in the city-cut suit and the inquisitive gleam in his gaze, and a wall seemed to descend behind his own. He paid with a silver coin, and the bartender made no move to open the till, simply pocketing the money with a grim finality. When Elias casually remarked on the quiet, the man just shook his head, a barely perceptible motion. "Clock stopped," was all he muttered, his voice a low, gravelly thing, before turning his back. The other patrons offered nothing but averted eyes and hunched shoulders. Their wariness was a palpable force, a collective secret held so tightly it had become a physical part of them. They were not just unfriendly. They were guarding something, a truth so terrible it had leached the very time from their world. Back on the street, the afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows, but the air remained unnaturally cold. A woman hurried past, pulling a shawl over her head and refusing to meet his eyes. A child peeked from behind a curtain in an upstairs window, his face pale and solemn, before being quickly yanked back into the gloom. This was more than simple superstition or mass hysteria. This was a deep, festering secret, a rot at the town's core that everyone knew was there, but no one dared to touch. Elias Thorne felt the old, familiar thrill of a story ignite in his chest, the journalist's instinct to dig, to pry, to expose. The desolation, the stopped clocks, the veiled terror in the eyes of the locals. It was a mystery, and he was resolved to pick at its threads until the whole terrible tapestry unraveled before him. The mist that clung to Oakwood at dawn was not born of the river or the morning dew. It was a shroud, a spectral breath exhaled by the town itself, thick with the residue of frozen time. Elias Thorne walked its empty streets as the first pale light bled into the sky, his footsteps the only sound in a world holding its breath. The familiar architecture of a small Missouri town, the clapboard houses, the mercantile with its faded signs, felt like a stage set, a hollow replica waiting for actors who would never arrive. His own breath plumed before him, a fleeting, living thing in the profound stillness. He first heard the whispers near the livery stable, a sibilant rustle like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones. Yet there were no leaves, no wind. The sound seemed to come from just beyond the edge of vision, a chorus of faint, pleading voices tangled together. He stopped, straining to listen, but the words dissolved into meaningless noise the moment he focused on them. They were not meant for his ears, these echoes. They were the town's subconscious murmuring, the sound of secrets it could no longer fully contain. Then he saw the first of the figures, a tall, slender shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom of an alleyway. It had the vague shape of a man, but its edges bled into the mist, formless and shifting. Elias's pulse quickened, a journalist's curiosity overriding a more primal fear. He took a step forward, his hand raised as if to call out, but the figure dissolved. It did not run or fade. It simply unraveled into threads of darkness that were swallowed by the pervasive gray. A moment later, another flicker of movement caught his eye near the dry water pump in the town square. A smaller, quicker shadow that darted behind the stone base and was gone before he could even turn his head fully. He walked on, his senses heightened to a razor's edge. The feeling of being watched was a physical pressure between his shoulder blades, a cold, unwavering gaze that tracked his progress down the center of Main Street. He spun around, his eyes scanning the blank, dark windows of the shops and homes. Nothing moved, yet the presence remained, an intelligence lurking just beyond the veil of the visible world, observing him with a detached, ancient curiosity. It was not the furtive, guilty watchfulness of the townsfolk. This was something older, hungrier, a patient predator assessing a new element in its domain. The mist began to thin as the sun rose higher, but the oppressive atmosphere did not lift. If anything, the growing light only made the emptiness more stark, the silence more accusatory. The whispers faded with the shadows, and the figures retreated, but the sensation of the unseen never left him. It fueled a cold fire in his gut, a determination that hardened with every silent, solitary step. This was no mere oddity for a sensational newspaper column. Oakwood was sick, poisoned by a truth so terrible it had manifested in these phantoms and this frozen hour. Elias Thorne would find that truth, no matter how deeply it was buried or how fiercely it was guarded. The presence watching him from the void had, in its silent scrutiny, issued a challenge, and he was a man who never refused one. The scream that shattered Oakwood's unnatural silence was a raw, human sound of pure terror, a sound that the frozen clocks could not mute. It came from the small clapboard house at the end of Willow Lane, the home of the miller, and it carried on the still air with a clarity that brought the few people outdoors to a standstill. Elias, who had been examining the unervingly static hands of the church clock, felt the sound like a physical blow. He turned and ran toward the source, his journalist's instinct propelling him toward the heart of the crisis. He arrived to find a scene of burgeoning chaos. Mary Miller stood on her porch, her face a mask of utter devastation, her body trembling so violently she could barely stand. Her husband, John, was clutching the doorframe, his knuckles white, his broad shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. Between ragged, gasping sobs, the story tumbled out. Their son, 7-year-old Tommy, had been put to bed the night before. He had been there, a small, warm lump beneath the quilts, when Mary checked on him before retiring. This morning his bed was empty. The covers were thrown back, but the impression of his head on the pillow was the only trace he had ever been there at all. No open window, no disturbed lock, no footprint in the soft earth beneath his sill. He had simply ceased to be. Panic, held at bay by the town's stunned silence, now erupted with a vengeance. Neighbors gathered, their faces pale, their voices a frantic, overlapping buzz. They spoke of other children years ago who had vanished in the same impossible way, their names now whispered like ghosts. The fear was a contagion, spreading from porch to porch, a collective dread that had found its latest, most terrible confirmation. The stopped clocks were no longer just a bizarre phenomenon. They were a countdown to this, a harbinger of a loss that tore at the very fabric of family and community. Elias moved through the crowd, not as a gawker, but as a calm presence in the storm of grief. He did not speak platitudes. He simply stood with the Millers, his silence a more profound comfort than empty words. He watched as John Miller's anger warred with his despair, and as Mary's tears carved paths through her shock. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, a vow made not to the crowd, but to the heartbroken parents. He pledged to find answers, to use every resource and ounce of his will to uncover what had happened to their boy. The promise hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in a house suffocated by loss. As the initial shock began to subside into a numb, aching horror, Elias's eyes, ever searching, scanned the periphery of the property. It was then he saw them, almost hidden in the deep shadow where the house's foundation met the earth. Etched into the whitewashed wood, so faint they could have been scratches from a stray animal, were a series of symbols. They were angular and strange, unlike any language or marking he had ever seen. One resembled a broken circle with a line through it, another a series of interconnected hooks. They felt old, not freshly carved, but weathered into the grain, as if they had been there for a very long time, waiting. They were a message, or perhaps a warning, left by whatever force had stolen a child from his bed without a sound. And looking at them, Elias felt the first true, icy finger of dread trace its way down his spine. The mystery of Oakwood had just become profoundly, tragically personal. The air in Oakwood had thickened since Tommy Miller's disappearance, the silence now layered with a new, sharp-edged dread. Elias Thorne moved through the town not as a curious observer, but as a hunter stalking a truth that everyone seemed determined to bury. He began with the baker, a stout man named Mr. Henderson whose shop usually smelled of yeast and warmth, but today held the faint, metallic scent of fear. The man's hands, usually dusted with flour, were clenched tight on his counter, his knuckles pale. When Elias mentioned the vanished boy and the frozen clocks, Henderson's eyes darted toward the door as if expecting a reprimand from the very air. He spoke in a hushed, hurried tone, his words circling the heart of the matter without ever landing. He muttered about a sourness that had settled on the town a decade past, a shadow that never lifted. He called it a curse, his voice dropping to a whisper on the word, but when Elias pressed for details, What kind of curse? Who cast it? Why? The baker's mouth snapped shut. He wiped his hands on his apron, a frantic, useless motion, and turned away, muttering about checking his ovens. His broad back a wall of final, terrified refusal. Next, Elias sought out the schoolteacher, Miss Eleanor Prentice. He found her in the empty schoolhouse, sitting at her desk and staring out at the deserted playground. She was a woman in her middle years, with intelligent eyes that were now clouded with a deep, weary sorrow. She did not startle when he entered, merely turned her gaze upon him, and in it, he saw a profound and helpless knowledge. She spoke of the children, of how their laughter had slowly been leached from the town, replaced by a watchful quietness that was unnatural in the young. She confirmed the pattern, her voice barely above a murmur, that the disappearances had begun not long after the clocks had stopped, a grim harvest that came every few years. She hinted at a terrible bargain, a choice made in desperation by those long gone, a debt that was now being collected from the innocent. But when Elias asked who made this bargain, or to whom the debt was owed, a spasm of pure terror crossed her face. She looked toward the window, at the unmoving hands of the town hall clock, and shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The fear in the room was so palpable it felt like a third presence, silencing her more effectively than any threat. These interviews, these fractured confessions of terror, were like gathering shards of a shattered mirror. Alone in his rented room, Elias laid the pieces out in his mind. The baker's decade-old curse, the schoolteacher's terrible bargain, the grieving mother's testimony of disappearances linked to a specific, frozen time, and the strange, weathered symbols near Tommy's window. They all spiraled inward, pointing toward a single catastrophic event that had occurred 10 years ago, an event so traumatic that the town had tried to erase it, only to find it had instead been fossilized in the very flow of time itself. The clock stopping was not the cause of the horror. It was a symptom, a monumental, supernatural scar. It was the town's shame and its secret, made manifest for all to see, yet whose meaning only a handful of terrified souls dared to remember. Every refused detail, every flicker of panic in a local's eye, was another thread, and Elias, with a growing chill of certainty, knew he was pulling on the one that would unravel the entire dreadful tapestry. The Oakwood Town Hall stood as a monument to forgotten civic pride, its white pillars stained gray by time and neglect, a fitting vault for the secrets Elias was determined to crack. He had gained entry not through official permission, the mayor had been conspicuously absent, but through the sympathetic, trembling hand of a junior clerk who feared the present more than he respected the past. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the scent of decaying paper, old wood, and the profound dust of years undisturbed. Sunlight, feeble and grudging, filtered through grime-caked windows, illuminating swirling motes that danced like agitated spirits in the beam. The grand clock in the lobby was, of course, frozen at 3:33, its silent face a constant, mocking reminder of his purpose. He found the records room in the basement, a low-ceilinged cavern where shadows clung to stacks of ledgers and teetering piles of cardboard boxes. It was a graveyard of bureaucracy, a place where the town's official memory had been left to molder. For hours, Elias worked, his movements stirring up clouds of dust that caught in his throat. He ran his fingers over tax rolls from the 1870s, minutes from town council meetings debating the price of hay, and birth and death records that told simple human stories. But he was searching for a rupture, a scar in the neat script that would indicate the moment everything had changed. He found it tucked away in a corner, shoved behind a broken chair as if in shame. A stack of the Oakwood Sentinel, their once bold headlines now faded to a sickly yellow. The papers from the spring of 1878 were brittle to the touch, threatening to crumble into nothingness. And there it was, the front page from April 12th. The headline was a stark, black banner of tragedy. Inferno consumes millwork factory, 30 lost. His heart hammered against his ribs as he smoothed the fragile page on the dusty floor. The article spoke of a sudden, violent blaze that had erupted in the heart of the night, a fire so intense and fast-moving that escape was nearly impossible. It listed names, a roll call of the dead men, women, even a few older children who had been working the night shift. The descriptions were lurid, Victorian in their detail, speaking of screams heard from the heart of the flames and a glow in the sky that could be seen for miles. But it was a single, almost casual sentence buried in the third paragraph that froze the blood in his veins. A quote from the night watchman, who had been the first to raise the alarm, stated that he had seen the first flicker of orange light in the factory's main workshop at precisely 3:33 in the morning. Elias sat back on his heels, the dusty air suddenly cold in his lungs. The number echoed in the silent room, a dreadful chime connecting two disparate points in time. The factory fire 10 years ago, a catastrophic event that had stolen 30 souls, and the current, pervasive horror that had stolen time itself and now its children, were bound together by this one, impossible, repeating moment. 3:33. It was not a coincidence. It was a signature. The fire had been the genesis, the terrible birth of the curse the townsfolk whispered about. And now, a decade later, the debt was being called in, not with fire, but with an endless silent night and the theft of the innocent. The dusty archives had given up their central, terrible truth. The past was not dead. It was a predator, and it was hunting again on the same schedule. The date of the fire was now a brand seared into Elias's mind, a fixed point from which all of Oakwood's present horrors radiated. The yellowed newspaper in the town hall basement had provided the skeleton of the tragedy, but Elias needed the flesh and blood of memory, the whispered truths that official records deliberately omitted. He spent the next day pursuing the ghosts of survivors, those who had escaped the inferno but had been living in its long, cold shadow ever since. He found them in cramped cottages on the town's outskirts, their faces etched with a permanent grief, their eyes holding the distant, flickering glow of that night. They spoke in halting, reluctant sentences, their words often trailing off as they glanced toward their windows, as if the past might be listening at the glass. They confirmed the official time of the blaze, 3:33 a.m., with a chilling uniformity, but they also spoke of things the newspaper had not printed. An elderly former foreman, his hands still scarred by old burns, described a pervasive, oily smell that had hung in the factory for days beforehand, a scent no one could source. A woman who had lost her husband confessed that in the week leading up to the fire, several workers had complained of waking from nightmares of being smothered by smoke, only to find their rooms clear and airy. These were not the straightforward omens of faulty wiring or spilled lamp oil. They were psychological tremors, premonitions that something born of more than mere accident was stirring in the darkness. Most damning of all was the hushed talk of the investigation, or rather, the lack of one. The town council, led by Mayor Higgins's predecessor, had declared the cause undetermined, a tragic act of God, and had swiftly ordered the ruins razed. The insurance payout had been surprisingly swift, the funds used to prop up the town's faltering economy, but the whispers persisted. There had been talk of a locked door that should have been open, of firefighting equipment that was found to be inexplicably sabotaged, rumors of a cover-up to protect the town from the scandal of negligence or, even worse, something deliberately set. The official story was a thin veneer painted over a rotted truth, and everyone knew it. But fear and a desperate need for stability had kept the lies intact for a decade. His most revealing interview was with Mrs. Agnes Peabody, an elderly widow who lived in a small, immaculate house filled with the ghosts of her family. She had lost a son and a daughter-in-law in the fire. Her parlor was a shrine to their memory, with framed daguerreotypes of smiling, vibrant young people who were now ash. Her grief was not the raw, fresh wound of the Millers. It was a deep, settled ache, a mountain she had been climbing for 10 years. She welcomed Elias with a quiet dignity, her eyes sharp and intelligent despite their sorrow. Over a cup of lukewarm tea, she spoke of the rumors that had swirled in the fire's immediate aftermath, whispers too terrible for the newspaper and too dangerous for the town square. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. The most persistent story, she said, was that on the night of the fire, a small, secretive group of the town's most powerful men, the factory owner, the mayor, the bank manager, had gathered not to mourn but to bargain. Desperate to save Oakwood from total economic collapse, They had sought a power beyond the mundane. The story varied in the telling, but the core remained. They had made a pact. They had offered the 30 souls lost in the fire as a down payment to a hungry entity, a demon of smoke and shadow, in exchange for the town's survival and future prosperity. The stopped clocks, she whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped her teacup, were not a curse laid upon the town, but a part of the bargain itself. A way to mark the moment of the offering and signal the demon's enduring claim. The missing children were not random victims. They were the interest on a terrible supernatural debt, a debt that was now coming due with a vengeance. The world had become a gallery of the dead, every reflective surface a window into a silent, pleading purgatory. It began subtly for Elias, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye as he passed a rain barrel, the water within still and dark from the previous night's shower. He paused, thinking it a trick of the weary light, and leaned closer. His own tired, stubbled face stared back from the murky surface, but beneath it, superimposed like a phantom negative, was another. A woman's face, her features blurred and wavering as if seen through heat haze, her mouth open in a soundless scream, her eyes wide with an agony that had not faded in a decade. He recoiled, stumbling back, and the image vanished, leaving only his own shocked reflection. He told himself it was fatigue, the product of sleepless nights and a mind saturated with horror, but the chill that had settled in his bones was not so easily dismissed. Later, in the dusty quiet of his rented room above the saloon, he caught another glimpse. He was washing his face in the chipped porcelain basin, the water cold and bracing. As he straightened up, dripping, he saw them in the tarnished mirror above the stand. Not just one, but a crowd of them, their faces pressed against the inside of the glass like prisoners behind a grimy pane. Men with soot-streaked cheeks, women with their hair aflame in a spectral wind, their hands raised not in menace, but in desperate, silent supplication. They were the 30, the souls consumed by the factory fire, their final moments of terror frozen for eternity, not in time, but in reflection. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the room behind him was empty, filled only with the late afternoon sun cutting bars of light through the motes of dust. When he turned back to the mirror, only his own pale, wide-eyed face remained, a solitary witness to an audience of ghosts. He began to test the phenomenon, moving through Oakwood with a new, dreadful purpose. He peered into the window of the abandoned general store, and in the grime-coated glass, a child's face, small and pale, materialized beside his own, its eyes deep pools of sorrow. He stared into the polished brass of a hitching post and saw the gaunt, hollow-cheeked visage of a man he recognized from the list of the dead. The faces were never aggressive. Their silence was not one of threat, but of an immense, unbearable grief. They were trapped, their spirits anchored not to a place, but to the very act of reflection, bound to the moment of their death by the same unnatural pact that had halted the clocks. And then, the final, terrible connection snapped into place with the force of a physical blow. He was standing by the horse trough in the square, watching the ghost of a young woman fade from the water's surface, when he remembered the miller's description of Tommy's room. The open window, the lack of a forced entry. The boy had vanished from his bed, leaving no trace but the impression on his pillow and those strange, weathered symbols on the foundation. But what if the entry point hadn't been the window or the door? What if something had reached through the reflection in his bedroom window, or the dark surface of the water glass on his nightstand? The missing children weren't being taken from their beds. They were being pulled through the mirrors, through the puddles, through any still surface that could hold a ghostly image. They were being collected, their fresh, innocent souls offered to the same entity that held the fire victims in its thrall. The stopped clocks at 3:33 marked the moment of the original sacrifice, and the reflections were the ongoing conduit, the open channel through which the debt was paid. The dead in the mirrors were not just haunting him. They were showing him the horrifying mechanics of the curse, a cycle of loss that repeated itself not with flame, but with stolen reflections and stolen time. The woods beyond Oakwood were a world apart, a place where the curse's grip seemed to tighten into a physical stranglehold. The trees grew thick and twisted, their branches interlaced like bony fingers clawing at a sky the color of bruised slate. No birdsong pierced the heavy silence. No rustle of undergrowth hinted at life. The only sound was the crunch of Elias's own boots on the carpet of dead leaves. A solitary drumbeat in a forest holding its breath. He had followed a rumor, a thread of gossip from a drunken stable hand about an old man who had fled the town years ago, a man who knew the price of its survival. The path was little more than a deer trail, choked with brambles that snatched at his trousers as if the very wilderness sought to deter him. He found the cabin nestled in a small, gloomy clearing, looking less built and more like a growth that had erupted from the forest floor. It was a squat, miserable structure of rotting logs and a moss-eaten roof, with a single window so grimy it seemed to absorb the weak light. A thin, wraith-like tendril of smoke curled from a makeshift chimney of stacked stones, the only sign of habitation in the oppressive stillness. As Elias approached, the feeling of being watched returned, but this was different. Not the ancient, predatory gaze of the entity, but the furtive, terrified scrutiny of a cornered animal. The door creaked open before he could knock, revealing a figure so gaunt and weathered he seemed a part of the cabin itself. Old Man Hemlock stood there, his frame stooped and brittle, his clothes hanging from him in tattered rags. His face was a web of deep lines, his eyes sunken into sockets so dark they looked like holes burned into parchment. But in their depths, a sharp, fearful intelligence still flickered. He did not seem surprised to see Elias. It was as if he had been waiting a long time for someone to come and demand the burden he carried. Inside, the cabin was a single room, reeking of wood smoke, earth, and a profound, unwashed loneliness. The only furnishings were a crude cot, a rickety table, and a single chair. Hemlock gestured for Elias to sit, his movements slow and pained, as if every joint protested. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the meager fire in the hearth. Then, the old man began to speak, his voice a dry rustle, the sound of dead leaves skittering across stone. He confessed it all, the words tumbling out in a hoarse, relentless stream, as if a dam had broken inside him. He spoke of the days after the factory fire, the town teetering on the brink of ruin, the fear and desperation that had soured the air. He named names: Mayor Higgins's father, the bank manager, the factory owner, men of standing and power who had been driven to the edge of damnation by their love for Oakwood. They had gathered in secret, not in the church or the town hall, but in the scorched, still smoking ruins of the factory itself, amidst the ashes of the dead. There, in that charnel house, they had called out into the darkness, offering not prayers, but a bargain. They had summoned a presence, a thing of ancient hunger that fed on despair. Hemlock's voice trembled as he described it, not as a demon of fire and brimstone, but as a cold intelligence, a void that promised salvation in exchange for sustenance. The pact was simple and monstrous. The 30 souls lost in the fire were the initial offering, a down payment to spare the town from economic collapse. But the entity's hunger was eternal. In return for its patronage, for the luck that would keep the crops from failing and new businesses from fleeing, it demanded a tithe. Every 10 years, on the anniversary of the pact, it would return. The stopping of the clocks at 3:33 a.m. was its herald, a signal that the time of collection had come. And its price was a soul, a fresh, innocent soul, always a child, to be drawn through the reflections it now controlled, just as it held the fire victims captive within them. Hemlock wept then, dry, racking sobs that shook his frail body. He had been there. He had been the town's blacksmith, a man of strong arms and a stronger conscience, and the memory of that night had broken him. He had watched his friends and neighbors trade their humanity for security, and he had fled into the woods, choosing a life of solitude and terror over living in a town that fed its young to a shadow. He looked at Elias, his eyes pools of bottomless guilt and relief. The secret was out. The hermit had finally passed his terrible knowledge to another, and in the dim, smoky light of the cabin, the full, horrifying truth of Oakwood's bargain settled upon Elias Thorne like a shroud of ice. The weight of Hemlock's confession settled in the cabin's stale air, a tangible presence of guilt and horror that seemed to thicken the very gloom. The old man's frail body slumped further into his chair, as if the act of speaking the truth had physically drained the last of his strength. His sunken eyes, fixed on the dying embers in the hearth, held a decade of haunted knowledge. He explained the mechanics of the demon's return with a chilling, matter-of-fact dread that was worse than any outburst of terror. The cessation of the clocks was not a side effect or a curse laid upon the town. It was a deliberate signal, a supernatural alarm clock ringing in the void to announce the entity's awakening. For the duration of that frozen hour, an hour that could stretch for days or weeks, the barrier between worlds grew thin, and the demon's influence bled into Oakwood, turning every reflective surface into a potential doorway. Its demand was absolute and horrifyingly specific. A child's soul, untouched by the cynicism and compromises of adulthood, a pure and potent fuel for its ancient, insatiable hunger. The children were not simply killed. They were consumed, their essence drawn through mirrors, still water, or any glassy surface that could hold a captive image, joining the 30 fire victims in a silent, spectral limbo. The townsfolk who knew the secret, the descendants of the original conspirators, lived in a state of perpetual, gut-wrenching dread as the 10th year approached, watching their own children and their neighbors with a terrible, guilty knowledge. They were prisoners of a pact their forebears had made, forced to become accomplices in a periodic ritual of sacrifice to maintain the fragile, cursed peace that allowed Oakwood to exist. The clock stoppage was their sentence, and the vanishing of a child was its execution. Elias sat in silence, the hermit's words echoing in the cavern of his mind. The moral horror of it was a physical sickness in his gut. This was not a ghost story. It was a meticulously maintained economy of souls, a town that had mortgaged its future to a malevolent force. The grieving parents, the fearful whispers, the hostile sheriff. It all crystallized into a single, monstrous picture. These people weren't just hiding a secret. They were living with an active, ongoing atrocity, one they felt powerless to stop. The entity held them hostage with their own history, its power woven into the very fabric of their survival. A cold, hard resolve began to form within Elias, cutting through the initial wave of revulsion. This cycle of sanctioned murder, this feeding of innocence to darkness, would end. He would break it. The vow was silent, but it rang with the clarity of forged steel in the quiet cabin. He would not be another passive witness, another terrified soul cowed by the unnatural. He had come to Oakwood for a story, but he would leave having written a different ending altogether. The burden of the bargain had been passed to him, and he would not rest until he had shattered its chains, no matter the cost to himself or the terrified, complicit town. The truth was no longer just something to be uncovered. It was a weapon, and he was sharpening its edge for a confrontation with the darkness itself. The hermit's words were a key, turning the tumblers of a lock Elias had been straining against since his arrival. Back in the suffocating silence of his rented room, the disparate threads of Oakwood's horror, the frozen clocks, the spectral faces in the mirrors, the hermit's confession, the vanished boy, suddenly wove themselves into a single, monstrous tapestry. The missing children were not random victims of a haunting. They were deliberate offerings, a tithe paid to a hungry god of shadow and memory. The knowledge settled in his gut like a shard of ice, cold and sharp. He had the why and the who. Now he needed the proof, the ledger of this damned transaction. He waited until the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting just enough light to navigate the treacherous path back to the town hall. The building was a mausoleum at night, its white pillars glowing faintly in the gloom. He bypassed the main door, its lock a formidable barrier, and instead slipped around to a cellar window half hidden by overgrown ivy. The latch was rusted but yielded to the insistent pressure of his knife. He dropped into the basement, the impact a dull thud in the profound quiet, and was once again enveloped by the scent of decay and forgotten things. He ignored the main records room this time. Hemlock's story had hinted at a deeper secrecy, a record kept not for bureaucracy, but for accountability among the damned. His lantern cast a jittering pool of light as he moved past stacks of ledgers, his eyes scanning for a hideaway that felt more deliberate. He found it behind a false wall of loose bricks at the very rear of the cellar, a space so narrow he had to turn sideways to enter. Inside was a single, small strongbox, its metal tarnished black with age. The lock was stout, but Elias, driven by a furious purpose, worked at it with his tools until it sprang open with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, leather-bound ledger. It was not labeled, but its very presence in this secret niche screamed its importance. His hands, surprisingly steady, lifted it out and opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, precise script, a chillingly mundane record of the most unnatural of crimes. Column after column listed names and dates, a grim chronology of loss. The first entry was dated April 12, 1878, and contained 30 names, the victims of the factory fire, the initial sacrifice. Below them, at 10-year intervals, were single names, each a child. 1888, 1898. The list was a timeline of Oakwood's damnation, a receipt for souls bartered for prosperity. His blood ran cold as his finger traced down the most recent entries. The last name was Thomas Miller, 1908. And there, at the bottom of the page, written in the same steady hand but with fresh ink, was the next name, scheduled for this very year. Sarah Higgins. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. Sarah, the mayor's own daughter. A girl he had seen only in passing. A wisp of a thing with solemn eyes, often seen reading on the porch of the town's grandest house. The ledger's cold logic was absolute. The pact demanded a child, and the ruling families who had initiated this horror were not exempt from its price. Their turn in the rotation had come. The cycle of sacrifice was a wheel that crushed everyone eventually, a perfect, terrible engine of despair. Elias closed the ledger, the soft thud of its cover a final, dreadful confirmation. He now held the entire, ugly truth in his hands. The missing pieces were all in place, and they formed a picture of a town devouring its own future to pay for its tainted past. And the next innocent soul on the altar was named Sarah. The church stood as a sentinel in the unnatural dark, its spire a black needle stitching the starless sky. Elias moved through the graveyard like a wraith himself, his every sense honed to a razor's edge. The faint, golden glow seeping from a cellar window near the foundation was the only sign of life in the entire town, a beacon of conspiracy in the endless night. The hermit's words and the damning ledger had led him here, to this moment, to witness the mechanics of the sacrifice firsthand. He dropped to his hands and knees, the damp earth soaking through his trousers, and crept toward the sliver of light. The window was set low, its glass thick and warped, but it offered a distorted view of the scene below. The church cellar was a cavern of shadows and trembling candlelight, the air thick with the smell of old stone, beeswax, and the sharp, coppery tang of fear. Mayor Higgins stood at the center of the small gathering, his usual air of pompous authority stripped away, replaced by a palpable, sweating desperation. His face, illuminated from below by a single candle on a rough-hewn table, was a mask of conflicted agony. Beside him stood Sheriff Dobbs, his massive frame looking strangely shrunken, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. The bank manager, Mr. Shaw, was there too, wringing his hands, his eyes darting nervously around the stone walls as if they might collapse in on him at any moment. They were preparing the space. A small, plain wooden chair had been placed directly in the center of the room, facing a large, ornately framed mirror that leaned against the far wall. The glass of the mirror was not clear. It seemed to hold a darkness deeper than the room's shadows, a void that swallowed the candlelight. Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was the threshold. This was the doorway through which they would send an innocent child to her doom. He watched, his stomach churning, as Higgins pulled a small, porcelain doll from a velvet bag. It was a child's toy, its painted smile a grotesque parody in the grim setting. With trembling hands, the mayor placed it on the seat of the chair, a stand-in for the real offering to come. The men then began a silent, ritualistic circuit around the chair, their footsteps muffled on the earthen floor. There were no incantations, no dark robes. Their ceremony was one of grim necessity and profound guilt. Their movements were stiff, jerky, the actions of men performing a hated duty, their souls screaming in silent protest even as their bodies went through the motions. Elias could see the weight of their complicity crushing them. Higgins paused in his pacing, his shoulders slumping as he stared into the dark mirror. For a fleeting moment, his mayoral facade completely crumbled, and Elias saw the raw, unvarnished torment of a father who knew he was condemning his own daughter. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek before he angrily brushed it away. Sheriff Dobbs refused to look at the chair or the mirror, his gaze fixed on the floor, his jaw working as if he were grinding his own teeth to dust. Shaw muttered under his breath, a continuous, frantic stream of self-justification that was too low for Elias to hear, but its frantic rhythm spoke of a mind teetering on the edge of collapse. This was not the meeting of powerful, malevolent cultists he might have imagined. It was a gathering of broken men, trapped by the sins of their fathers and their own cowardice, preparing to commit an atrocity not out of dark faith, but out of a desperate, terrified belief that it was the only way to keep the fragile world from shattering completely. Their desperation was a sour odor in the air, and their guilt was a fifth presence in the room, more solid than any of them. They were not monsters. They were damned men, and the sight of their humanity, twisted and corrupted by this unspeakable pact, was in its own way more horrifying than any spectral visage. Elias watched, a silent witness to their damnation, knowing that this pathetic, guilt-ridden conspiracy in the cellar was the true heart of Oakwood's darkness. The cellar door splintered inward with a crack that tore through the church's sacred silence, a profane echo in a place already steeped in blasphemy. Elias Thorne stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette stark against the gloom of the nave behind him. He was no longer the curious journalist from the city. He was an avenging spirit, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with the terrible knowledge he carried. The three men in the cellar froze, their ritualistic movements halting mid-step. The porcelain doll on the chair seemed to leer in the flickering candlelight, its painted smile a mockery of the innocence they were preparing to destroy. Mayor Higgins was the first to recover, his politician's instincts slamming a mask of outraged authority over his guilt. He drew himself up, his chest puffing out, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion, his words a hollow performance. Elias ignored him, his gaze sweeping over the pathetic scene. The single chair, the dark mirror, the faces of men who had traded their souls for the illusion of stability. He took a step forward, his voice low but carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. He did not accuse them of conspiracy or dark magic. He used a simpler, more damning word: murder. He accused them of the premeditated murder of Thomas Miller, and of every child whose name was etched in the ledger hidden in the town hall cellar, and of the planned murder of Sarah Higgins. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic sputter of a candle. Then, the defenses crumbled, not with denial, but with a desperate, ugly justification. Higgins's voice rose, sharp and brittle. He spoke of survival, of the greater good, of the unthinkable collapse that would consume Oakwood if the pact were broken. He painted a picture of starvation, of desolation, of the town becoming a ghost in truth, all its people lost. The fire had been an act of God, he argued, his voice cracking, but the pact was their choice, a terrible, necessary burden to salvage a future from the ashes. Sheriff Dobbs grunted in agreement, a low, animal sound, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his eyes saying what his mouth would not, that some truths were too dangerous to live. Elias stood his ground, the air crackling with the tension. He did not shout. Instead, he peeled back their layers of pragmatic horror, appealing to the sliver of humanity he had seen in their tormented eyes just moments before. He spoke of Mary Miller's shattered face, of the small, empty bed on Willow Lane. He asked them to look into the dark glass of the mirror and see not a demon, but the reflection of their own corrupted souls. He forced them to imagine Sarah, not as an abstract sacrifice, but as a living, breathing girl, their own daughter, being pulled into that endless void. He spoke of legacies, of what they were truly building for the future. Not a thriving town, but a charnel house built on the bones of children, a monument to cowardice that would damn their names for all eternity. He was playing a dangerous game, standing alone against the entrenched power and desperation of these men. Sheriff Dobbs took a menacing step forward, his shadow looming large on the stone wall. The threat was palpable, a physical violence hanging in the air. Elias was risking everything, his story, his freedom, his very life. But he held the mayor's gaze, refusing to blink, forcing Higgins to stare into the abyss of his own actions. In that charged silence, amidst the candles and the shadowed mirror, Elias was not just confronting three men. He was taking a stand against the darkness they served, betting his own safety on the faint, flickering hope that a remnant of their conscience could still be stirred from its long, guilty sleep. The candles guttered as one, not from a draught, but from a pressure that descended upon the cellar, a force that crushed the air from the room and froze the very sweat on their skin. The darkness in the ornate mirror began to churn, no longer a passive void but a living, malevolent presence. It spilled over the frame, not as smoke or shadow, but as a shifting, liquid absence of light that drank the dim illumination from the room. The temperature plummeted, a cold so profound it felt like needles of ice driven into bone. Time, already fractured, seemed to shatter completely. The frantic pounding of Elias's heart slowed to a dull, leaden thud in his chest, and the panicked breaths of the other men hung in the air as frozen, crystalline plumes, suspended and unmoving. The entity coalesced before them, a towering form of rippling darkness that defied focus. It had no true shape, its outline constantly flowing and reforming, suggesting limbs, wings, and gaping maws that existed for a moment before dissolving back into the chaotic whole. It was the silence given form, the frozen moment made flesh, and its attention was a physical weight that pinned them where they stood. It ignored the cowering mayor and the sheriff, its formless gaze settling upon Elias. A deep, resonant thrum filled the air, a sound felt more than heard, vibrating in the marrow of his teeth. It was not a voice, but a concept of threat and ancient, terrible power forced directly into his mind. Then the visions came. The stone walls of the cellar melted away, replaced by a roaring, all-consuming inferno. The heat was a physical assault, the roar of the flames deafening. Elias saw men and women, their clothes and hair ablaze, stumbling through a hellscape of collapsing timber and molten metal. He heard their screams, not as distant echoes, but as immediate, agonized pleas that tore at his soul. He saw the face of the night watchman, his mouth open in a silent, eternal scream as he pointed to the clock face frozen at 3:33. The entity was not just showing him the past. It was making him live it, forcing him to feel the terror and the agony of its first, great feast. The fire was its genesis, its baptism of flame, and it wanted Elias to understand that its power was born from this absolute control over life and death. The scene shifted. He saw Tommy Miller, not as a ghost in a mirror, but as a small, confused boy standing in a featureless gray expanse, his hand outstretched toward a light he could never reach. He saw other children, their faces from the ledger, trapped in the same endless, silent limbo. The entity was the warden of this prison, the collector of these souls, and the vision was a stark, horrifying display of its claim. It held them all, the fire victims, the stolen children, in its grasp, their suffering the currency of its existence and the foundation of Oakwood's cursed prosperity. The message was clear and absolute. It held the power to grant life to the town and to snuff it out, to freeze time itself, and to claim any soul it desired. Elias was an insect before its magnitude, a fleeting spark of defiance in the face of an eternal, hungry night. The shifting shadow loomed over him, its formless presence a promise of annihilation, its silent, screaming history a testament to its absolute, merciless dominion. The town square of Oakwood had become a theater of the damned. It staged the dusty patch of earth where generations had gathered for festivals and fairs, now host to a final, desperate act of defiance. Elias Thorne stood on the empty water trough, the damning ledger held aloft in one hand like a preacher's Bible, his face pale but resolute in the gray, unchanging light. The unnatural stillness of the air seemed to listen, the frozen clocks on every building acting as silent, judgmental witnesses. He had gathered them not with shouts, but by moving through the streets with a grim purpose that drew the terrified from their homes, their curiosity overpowering their fear. They stood before him now, a sea of haggard, anxious faces. The baker, the schoolteacher, the grieving miller, and dozens more, their collective breath pluming in the cold. He did not begin with accusations or complex theories. He began with names. His voice, clear and steady, cut through the oppressive silence as he read them from the yellowed pages. The 30 souls lost in the factory fire, their fates not an accident but a down payment. Then the other names, the single, heartbreaking entries at 10-year intervals. He read Thomas Miller's name, and a raw sob tore from Mary Miller's throat, a sound of fresh agony that galvanized the crowd. He spoke of the pact, of the secret meeting in the ashes, of the desperate men who had traded the town's soul for its survival. He pointed to the mayor, the sheriff, and the bank manager, who stood at the edge of the crowd, their faces ashen, their guilt now a public spectacle. He held up the ledger, its neat script a testament to decades of sanctioned murder, and described the cold, logical horror of the cycle, the demon's hunger, and the terrible truth that the next name on the list was Sarah Higgins, the mayor's own child. As he spoke, as the full, ugly truth settled over the square, a sound began. It was faint at first, a dry, rusty click from the direction of the town hall. Then another from the clock above the bank. A slow, hesitant tick. Then a tock. One by one, throughout the square and spreading out into the side streets, the frozen clocks shuddered back to life. The sound was a deafening cacophony after the long silence, a metallic roaring as 100 pendulums began their swings and 100 sets of hands lurched forward from their eternal vigil at 3:33. The people gasped, clutching each other, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Time, the very river of their lives, had begun to flow again. The chain of the pact had been broken by the sheer, undeniable force of the truth. But the entity's vengeance was swift and cruel. As the clocks ticked their newfound rhythm, the whispers returned. They did not come from the shadows or the alleys. They seemed to emanate from the air itself, from the very ground beneath their feet. It was a soft, sibilant chorus, the sound of the 30 fire victims and all the stolen children, their trapped voices now unleashed upon the town they had been sacrificed to save. The whispers were not loud, but they were inescapable, a perpetual murmur of lost lives and endless sorrow that would forever haunt the streets of Oakwood. It was not silence that was the curse now, but memory, an eternal, auditory ghost that would never let them forget the price of their freedom. Elias stepped down from the trough, the ledger feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. The people were staring at him, their expressions a complex tapestry of gratitude, fear, and dawning horror at the new, whispered reality they inhabited. He had given them back their time, but he had also condemned them to an eternity of listening to its cost. He had broken the chain of sacrifice, but he had forged a new one of perpetual remembrance. As he walked away from the square, the triumphant ticking of the clocks a stark counterpoint to the mournful whispers on the wind, Elias Thorne was left to ponder the profound and terrible cost of truth, and whether some secrets, once unearthed, leave a scar upon the world that never truly heals.